The scripture reading this morning is from Matthew 4, verses 1 through 11. I'll be reading from the New International Version, NIV. That's our Pew Bibles, page 891. This is the word of our Lord. Jesus is tested in the wilderness. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. After fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. The tempter came to him and said, "If you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread." Jesus answered, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city and had him stand on the highest point of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and they will lift you up in their hands, so that you will not strike your foot against a stone." And Jesus answered him, "It is also written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. "All this I will give you," he said, "if you will bow down and worship me." And Jesus said to him, "Away from me, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve him only." Then the devil left him, and angels came and attended him.
When I was in seminary, a professor told our class a story one day that he had heard several years before when he was in England studying. A small country parish church had just received a new priest. And one day, as the new priest was familiarizing himself with his various weekday tasks, an elderly man came into the sanctuary and sat down at the very front of the church, right in front of the crucifix. And for an hour or more, this man sat there in silence. And when the time was up, he stood up and walked out without saying a word. Same thing happened the next day, and then the next, and the next. Finally, on the fifth day, the new priest decided to approach the elderly gentleman. He was most impressed with his devotion and curious as to what might be the focus of this man's prayers. So on that day, as the man stood up in silence without saying a word to head for the door, the priest graciously intercepted him. And after exchanging some brief pleasantries, the priest said, "May I ask what or who you are praying for in all these many hours of prayer?" And the elderly man replied, "I'm not praying for anything. I simply look at him, and he looks at me, and we are happy." That's how humanity began in our relationship with God. We were happy. Adam and Eve were generously cared for, surrounded by all that they needed and more. And the Lord walked with them in the cool of the day. God planted this wondrous garden, and humanity cared for it and tended it. We have to remember this is not the Corona Light vision of paradise. White sand, blue water, and no one else around and nothing to do but bask in the sun and listen to the waves and stir your drink with a tiny umbrella. No, Eden was paradise, but it was a place of utter connection, not privileged isolation. Humanity and creation, humanity and God, God and creation, all living together and working in harmony. Eden was a place of purpose as well as a place of abundance. But then something happened. Humanity was tempted by an alternative vision of reality, a vision offered up by the serpent. If they disobeyed God, the serpent promised, and ate from the tree in the center of the garden, then they could rise to the same level as God. Why settle for being creatures? The serpent said. You can be like God. So be like God. And they fell for it. Only they didn't see more. They simply saw differently. They saw their nakedness as something to be ashamed of. They felt the need to cover up. And that barrier, that separation, that shame, that lack of intimacy has defined human relationships ever since. Not just our relationship with God, but also our relationships with one another. Intimacy now has to be cultivated long and hard and intentionally with sweat and sometimes blood in the rocky soil east of Eden. It has to be tilled and kept both horizontally and vertically. Outside the garden, we now have to sweat and contend with all manner of thorns and thistles in just about every aspect of life. Even if your name is Jesus. Oh, and how the thorns spring up quickly. At the end of Matthew 3, there is this beautiful scene of John baptizing Jesus. Jesus comes to John and requests to be baptized, and John would have prevented him, saying, I need to be baptized by you, and you come to me? But Jesus answered, let it be so now, for it is proper for us in this way to fulfill all righteousness. Then John consented. And when Jesus had been baptized, just as he came up from the water, suddenly the heavens were opened to him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting upon him. And a voice from heaven said, This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased. Then immediately the Spirit sends Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted. To be tempted. That's the purpose of Jesus' visit. It seems a bit harsh for Jesus not to be able to revel in the glory of his Father's validation for just a moment. But we all know that life east of Eden is like that. It can turn in an instant. Thorns sprout quickly. And because Jesus is fully human as we are human, he has to learn to contend with this world as well as his own humanity, as all of us do. But more importantly, Jesus came to lead us back through all of these thorns and thistles, these disappointments and setbacks, back through these deserts of our own making, back to the kind of happy, intimate existence we knew once upon a time in Eden, back to the purposeful, connected life that we were created for. And he has to learn to be faithful to that mission, because he is going to face challenges from all corners, from religious authorities, from political authorities, even from within his own band of disciples. And that's why I believe the Spirit leads Jesus out into the wilderness before any of his public ministry gets underway. And that's why I also believe it is so very important for you and I, as Jesus' modern-day disciples, to follow him there. The Greek word that Matthew uses to describe the Spirit leading Jesus out into the wilderness is anago, which literally means to lead up from a lower place to a higher place. And there's a geographical dimension involved here. We are literally going up from the Jordan River, where Jesus has just been baptized, to higher ground. But I think the word is more significant than that, because the root word, ago, is often used in Greek to describe farmers leading oxen around their fields, plowing, cultivating, helping new things to come to life. And so it is in this agricultural manner that the Spirit takes Jesus out into the desert to face ha diabolos, the slanderer, the false accuser. It's a subtle but powerful indication of what the purpose of Jesus' visit to the desert is all about, what this business of temptation is all about. He's going to begin the process of reclaiming God's original vision of reality, that which now must be cast as an alternative vision to the alternative in which we actually live. And that alternative vision is the kingdom of heaven. He's going to cultivate, to tend what God is creating and planting, just as Adam and Eve had done when all was right with the world. Not surprisingly, then, we can see in the temptations that Jesus faces during these 40 days and 40 nights variations of the serpent's temptation way back in Genesis. Because ha diabolos basically says to Jesus, "Hey, Jesus, you're the Son of God. You should be like God. Why go hungry? For you, this desert could become a lavish buffet. Go ahead. Turn these stones into bread. Feed yourself. Be like God. Throw yourself off the top of the temple. Prove to everyone who you are. The angels will catch you, and then they'll serve you, just like God. Bow down before me, and you can have dominion over all that you can see. You can rule, just like God." But Jesus says no. No, because the goal isn't to be like God. Jesus is already like God, the very image of the living God. And as men and women created in God's image, you and I are already like God too. So the aim is not to be like God. The aim is to live in relationship with God, where God and humanity are once again together, where God looks upon us and we look upon God, and heaven and earth and everything in between are happy. And that's how Jesus is able to turn back the false accuser's advances, by leaning into life in relation to God, life with God. It is written, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by the very word that comes from the mouth of God." It is written, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test. Worship the Lord and serve only God." And when all is said and done, angels come to minister to him rather than to keep him at bay with their flaming swords. Lent is for us what 40 days in the wilderness was for Jesus. A time to wrestle with our own temptations, but more importantly, a time to get ourselves reoriented to the kingdom of heaven. Life with God. Life like it was in the garden, even though we remain far outside of it. A life of cultivation and purpose. And that requires us to once again learn to be naked and vulnerable and unashamed in God's presence, to walk with God, to resist the temptations that come at us, not only from serpents and slanderers, but also from the very bounty of the world that is around us. What looks good and tastes good may not necessarily be good for us, and that goes much deeper than sugar and cholesterol. So however you do it, I want to encourage you today to embrace and engage the holy season of Lent. It's traditional to give something up, and that's not a bad place to start. But if you do give something up for Lent, don't give it up as if something so trite as denying yourself chocolate for a month is going to help you better understand or identify with Jesus' suffering. Do it instead to remind yourself that life is not, in fact, a box of chocolates. That we human beings shall not and cannot live by chocolate or bread alone, and that happiness is not to be found in what we consume. Do it to remind yourself that true life, true happiness is relational, and its height and depth and breadth is to be found in our meaningful and purposeful relationships with each other, and above all, in our relationship with God. Helping us to rediscover that. That is what Lent is all about. So I'll also encourage you not just to give something up, but to take something up. Take up your cross and follow Jesus as he told us we must if we want to be his disciples. Take up that ministry to which God has been calling you, pushing you, nudging you toward, that you haven't quite given yourself over to. Take up spiritual disciplines like prayer and fasting. Stretch yourself. Let Christ stretch you and push you to really living into your faith. And as we go, let us do so knowing that Christ goes ahead of us. Christ blazed the trail into and through the wilderness. It's far too late to find our way back to Eden in this world, but God is still very much into gracious and generous provision. The angels sustained Jesus in the wilderness, and God will sustain us there too, if we have the courage to venture out, to honestly confront our desires and our temptations as they are set before us, to seek a more intimate, purposeful, harmonious relationship with God and with our neighbor. God will provide for us, just as God provides for us here today. The table is set. So let us eat eagerly and drink deeply, because the Lord is gracious and good, and we are all invited to the feast and to the journey. Thanks be to God. Amen.